Welcome incoming people. Some of your faces are appearing.
Thank you.
I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. We'll hold for just a minute while people come in before I introduce our distinguished guests from around the country. Well, hello everybody who is arriving and who has arrived. My name is Jay Tolson. I'm the editor of the Hedgehog Review at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture. Our intended host today, fortunately had to be away to be with his wife and newly arrived son, Kyle Williams. He was originally planning to be the host today, so I am standing in, and we send, if he joins us, we send him our best wishes. I know he's busy at his house right now with mother and child. Our guests today, and we're also down one of our guests today. Ohad Rice Sorokin has seemed to have been felled by a very bad chest flu or perhaps pneumonia. So he said he would be spewing and spitting if he got on board. So he has recused himself, I think, unless he pops up suddenly. I said, you know, if something miraculous happens, join us, Ohad. I will try to stand in for him a little on what his paper and point of view would be. But I hope that we get a chance to bring him back sometime. But we do have two great guests, and also another host here is Leanne Alspaugh, occupying one of our little squares next to me, at least on my screen, who's the managing editor of the Hedgehog Review. We also have the head of the Institute here, I believe, James Hunter, somewhere, but I thought I saw him. But I'm welcoming our two guests today, Mary Townsend, who is a professor of philosophy at St. John's University, and her book is The Woman Question. Is it the woman, not women? The Woman Question in Plato. And she has contributed pieces to the Hedgehog Review, not just this piece that we're talking about today, but others in the past. And we're always delighted to have her on our pages and now in person. And the other participant today is Blake Smith, an intellectual historian not from Chicago, but most recently was teaching at the University of Chicago before he went to Macedonia on a Fulbright fellowship. And actually, he's just returned from Macedonia and is working on his book, which is a book about Roland Barthes. So the essay he has contributed to this issue was very much on his mind, even before I asked him to contribute a piece on that subject. The topic today is, what does desire have to do with it? The it being knowledge, the pursuit of knowledge, and specifically, you might say, theory and theorism. We were just discussing before others came on board a profile in the New Yorker of another philosopher, Agnes Callard, which dealt very much with the question of love and eros and marriage and the life of the mind. And we might come back to that later in the discussion. But to get things going, I'd like to invite our participants. Blake has volunteered to go first. Mary is finishing her tea. So Blake will introduce give a brief overview of his essay, and then Mary will do same. and then they might go back and forth a little for a few minutes. I might interject a question or two, then we'll open it up to our guests. So Blake, head off,
Okay.
please.
Well, first of all, thank you so much to Jay and Leanne for organizing this and for having me in the issue. I'm from Tennessee, so it's nice to hear Southern accents. I don't know if like over Zoom that's enough to bring mine out, but it's good to hear, and it's good to see in the audience some real life friends, some people who I've just corresponded with virtually, and hopefully some new friends and acquaintances. This is material that I'm thinking through for a larger book project about Roland Barthes in the 70s and his thinking about love and politics. So like your questions, comments, critiques will all surely be good grist for the mill. What I was thinking about in the essay are two related and kind of contradictory questions that Barthes was thinking about, both having to do with desire and knowledge and desire and self-knowledge. So the first is a question that he is asking along with a kind of cohort of younger intellectuals, Michel Foucault, Gilles Deleuze in the 60s and 70s, which are coming out of a French reception of Nietzsche in those years. And I don't know enough about like the history of French reception of Nietzsche more generally, but there's a moment starting in the mid-60s out of a conference organized by Deleuze where a number of French thinkers are asking with Nietzsche, what's the relationship between the individual desiring self and abstract theoretical knowledge? And this is, for them, a pertinent question because it's pitched against structuralism. So it's pitched against the kind of big claim-making universalist theories of Levi-Strauss, Lacan, or the Marxist tradition. And so in the same way that Nietzsche is making a certain critique of the supposedly objective science of philology or other academic sciences in the late 19th century, or further in the background that Kierkegaard is making of the Hegelian system, these French guys are reactivating those critiques in a local context to inaugurate what becomes post-structuralism or postmodernism. And Barthes in particular is asking, both in these big abstract systems that would make claims about society, human nature, language, mind, as such, where am I, like the particular individual, like a singular subjectivity, but also who am I as a thinker to be wanting to be able to generate kind of universally valid general objective theory, like not just does this theory I come up with adequately like account for my existence, but what is like the kind of eros, what is the desire that is leading me to think in these terms. So at one point in the mid-70s, Barthes has a note to himself where he's like saying we should be asking with Nietzsche not what is the case, but who am I to be finding out that X is the case. So this is the first question, right? It's like the way that theory, and in particular this kind of big structuralist theory of the 50s and 60s in France, could be preventing us from asking questions about who we individually as thinkers are, or what our own personal, emotional, libidinal investment in apparently objective knowledge claims is. And the second is like a more private problem that Barthes has at the same time, which is that from the years 1974 to 1977 or 78, he falls really apparently desperately in love with this graduate student of his. So Barthes was sort of semi-openly gay, like in a way that everyone in the sort of academic world would know, And throughout the 60s and early 70s, he had fallen into a kind of typical, no offense to such people in the room, like older male professor stereotype of sleeping with like one graduate student after another, and then kind of throwing them back into the pool and, getting another one. Or we could think of like, Leonardo DiCaprio with these like girlfriends who disappear when they turn 25, right? There's just sort of a rotating cast of identically aged companions. And he didn't have that much emotional investment in any of them in particular. It seemed like, like many of them went on to become professors, so he mentored them. Many of them are now like Roland Barthes scholars, which is a bit weird. But so like the sort of French industry of studying Barthes is I won't name the names, but just like the main people who are editing his text now are like former lovers from this period. But he had his own friends. He was still living with his elderly mom. He didn't seem to like need these people for that much emotional connection. But then in the mid 70s, he manages to fall for I have to say not a particularly attractive straight one who was like already balding, at 24. Who seems he was balding, straight, living with his fiance. So like in many ways he's not a good candidate for such intense feelings, but maybe precisely for that reason, Bart seems to fall totally in love with him and is writing him multiple long romantic letters a day. The guy is still alive and still has, well, maybe still has this correspondence. So perhaps at some future date we'll get access to this, but currently that's just in someone's personal papers. And Bart becomes really desperate. Like he, in his journal, talks about thinking about suicide. He tries psychoanalysis. He has a couple of sessions with Lacan, which are apparently really unsuccessful. He describes them as just two old fools talking to each other. And one way of understanding what happens next is that he gives a series of lectures on love, on what he calls the lover's discourse, the discours amoureux, which is what people in love say, like what it's the both the feelings and the kind of discourse that accompanies this condition, which Bart is trying to think of as a generic human one. Like, we all fall in love. Everyone says, I love you, right? Like the Woody Allen movie. And this leads eventually to the publication in 1976 of the Fragments of a Lover's Discourse, which is one of Barthes' most famous texts. It becomes a surprise bestseller. And both at the time in reviews and subsequently in the literature, people talk about this as like one of the great modern accounts of what being in love is like. And it's tempting to read it as a theoretical triumph. Like Barthes was in the situation of private pain, of confusion and suffering. And how does he get out of that, like attachment to a single person? Well, he's able to generalize, to universalize the situation, to think, well, this is what being in love for anyone is like. And by describing its features, he's able to sort of move himself out of actually being in that emotional situation. So it's a kind of, contemporary version of Plato's, Socrates's, Diotima's ladder of love, right? And this is very much how Barthes' main biographer, Tiphaine Samoniaux, and his his now editor and like former companion Eric Marty like talks about this in his editing of these texts. But my essay zeroes in on one of Barthes' lectures that he gave building up to the book on I love you as a phrase, which he gave with this guy that he was in love with in the audience. So he's like performing theoretical mastery over the concept of being in love and the phrase I love you, but he's in fact also saying it like dozens of times over like the hour and a half of the lecture to the guy. And like he has a diary entry just from the night before where he's talking about how the guy never answers his letters, how he's so desperate, how he's thinking about killing himself. So instead of being a kind of, ascent from like the private, the emotional to the universal, the intellectual, there's, a shuttling back and forth. And I think the other question that had been occupying Barth at this time, this Nietzschean question of who am I to be wanting to theorize, right? Or like, what is theory doing for me personally? What's my investment into theory being true? Also undermines the very idea of this kind of dichotomous ascent from the personal to the intellectual, or that we need to read those two questions against each other. He sure sounds like a narcissist. Well, I don't know. I mean, right. I guess in some ways you fall in love with another person maybe to break open your self-image or to not be thinking about yourself. I mean, it's also no coincidence the book he writes while he's falling in love with this guy is an autobiography. And so I think maybe if the fear of the autobiography is like self-obsession, one way to break out of that is, falling desperately in love with someone who won't return your feelings, right? So you can be thinking about someone who's not you. But right, so just to conclude, like the reason that I think all this is interesting is, I mean, one, I sort of assume that Barth is a genius and that everything that he's doing, in his life and work is important. But I also think that both of these questions, which move in different directions, like how can we theorize the personal, like how can we gain a kind of leverage over our really intimate, private suffering by turning it into theory? And then how is theory disguising something about who we really are? Like how is theory like helping us attain self-knowledge? How is theory blocking self-knowledge? These are really a problem. And I don't say this in the essay, but one thing I've been thinking about is part of what Barth seems to be doing in his writing, he's searching for kind of new genres and forms to contain these two opposing questions. And he comes up with this idea of a fragmentary form of writing that he says dramatizes or theatricalizes the feeling of being in love and the search for knowledge. And in some ways, I think this is what like Alan Bloom in his reading of the symposium at the end of Love and Friendship is saying Plato is doing. Now, I'm not like a Plato person, and I'm not really a Strauss person, but I think it's provocative to think that Barth and maybe to another extent, like people like Foucault and Deleuze are working their way into the same kinds of concerns that people like Strauss and Bloom have for themselves and see in Plato, which is there a kind of polyphonic or dispersed genre form that lets us capture these different directions that the pursuit of love of the other, the desire for like knowing the world, knowing the self, are taking us in. Like if we can't integrate them into something like a treatise or a narrative, is there a way of maybe dramatizing those tensions and like making them bearable, but then also provoking thought in certain ways? And with that, I'll turn over to someone who actually does know about Plato. So maybe Mary can address that.
Thank you so much, Blake. No, I see a lot of overlap in our essays, and I was particularly excited. I mean, you're describing in many ways what the way I think that the reason why I love Plato, and the way that I think that the reason why I think Plato is such a profound philosopher, in that instead of doing theory, where theory is not involving me, but it's just this sort of abstract truth that's sort of hanging out in the air, which we all know is slightly not true, but we sort of say, okay, this is the truth. This is the theoretical truth. Whereas for Plato, philosophy always begins with a human being's desire to know something. And so the dialogues are always grounded in human character. So you never get that theory that's hanging out in the world. You always get some human who's trying to attempt to know something about something. So yeah, it seems such a great segue to me writing about Plato, is Plato trying to solve this, this split between knowledge and desire. And thanks so much to Jay and Leanne and the Hedgehog Review generally for having this conversation today. This is going to be very good. So my moment of starting to take up this story for this particular essay comes when I came across a novella by one of my old professors who tries to tell a fairly familiar story in a somewhat novel way about a thinker, a man who's devoted his entire life to trying to understand the whole world, and yet feels that he can't tell the difference between whether he's alive or whether he's dead, in this really sort of this deeply moving way. And so the story ends in classic fashion by he falls desperately in love with a student, and ends up following her to a mysterious cavern, and actually dies by drowning in the cave because he won't take the hand of the student who offers it to him. So it seemed to me to be a sort of play about this relationship between knowledge and desire. But as I was reading it and trying to think about different parallels to compare it to, I compare it to Thomas Mann's Death in Venice, as well as a recent article by Agnes Callard and her Harper's essay, Eros Monster. I was struck by this desire we seem to have to explain Eros as a tragedy. We want to say Eros is stronger than us. It's not domesticable in some important way. And therefore, oh no, it will end in this terrible tragedy. But look at me, I can sort of aesthetically enjoy the fact that it's not up to me. I will simply fail. And my failure is sort of beautiful in a way, which is not false. But there's also a sort of self-congratulatory way in which I think we sort of take up the tragic narrative of Eros, particularly sometimes in an otherwise boring middle-class life. We might say, oh, well, my life has become interesting because I let this uncontrollable force, which I personally could do nothing about, sort of take over my life briefly, however briefly. So I see this tension in trying to understand Eros in all of its strength, and but also not trying to tame it. But not trying to rationalize it away completely. And so I'm sort of wondering in the essay, like what kind of story really would balance those two elements? So part of the philosophical problem I see is that we've gotten locked into seeing the human being as both rationality and some kind of desire. And that these are both true elements of human psychology, but they simply are not the same. They don't overlap, and in fact, they fight, they war with one another. And so the human being fundamentally is composed of elements that just can't reconcile themselves in any sort of way. And obviously, you can map this onto the Cartesian split, the split between the mind and the body, the desire and the reason. And I think we should be suspicious of this because this is not necessarily what is true about human beings. It's simply what maybe a tragic sort of story we want to tell about ourselves. So looking for earlier models, I believe you can find this in Greek philosophy. I think I see elements for a better wholeness between reason and desire, both in Aristotle and in Plato. Aristotle has a more biological account. So he's trying to think, when he's thinking about how we choose things, how a human being reaches out, just almost if I reach out for food, do I reach for this food? Do I reach for that food? He sees the human being as something that is both thinking and desire at the same time. He says we're either thinking desire or desire that's thinking, because that's the kind of source of motion that we are. If we didn't have one or the other, we would not move. We'd simply be stuck. Or, if we were just pure desire, we could never choose one thing or the other. So for me, that's an image of one kind of sort of paradoxical wholeness of the human being. It's not satisfying because we want to pick. We want to say, okay, so which one's in charge, which one's primary, which one's better? But you kind of have to stop right there and say, no, they're fundamentally in tension and maybe in fact are somehow the same. So that gets you part of the way. And I think it's worth pointing out that we see the split between reason and desire. It's very, very vivid when it comes to romantic relationships. Obviously, in this case of Bart, it's very interesting. But I think you see this the sort of reason desire split in a lot of different situations. Like in the essay, I talked about the careerist who spends all their life seeing themselves as this combination of will and drive and force. Slightly different terms, but still you've got the drive, which is the desire, and the force, which is sort of the practical reason, sort of making you move through the world in this ambitious way. You see it in I joke about my college students, and that if you ask them what they want to do, they have no idea. They've never stopped to consider what they're doing there for. They're just kind of pursuing sort of a comfortable life and success that they've been told is valuable for them. But if you really ask them what they want, they would simply not know. So this is obviously a problem that goes beyond romance, because Kierkegaard points out that any sort of pursuit of success or knowledge in the world that doesn't also take into account your own desire, your own sense of self-knowledge, is going to leave you a fundamentally broken person who in a way is not even really a self. The self has to be some kind of vivid, visceral understanding of yourself, both as something directed outwards, but also containing interiority at the same time. So trying to harmonize reason and desire needs to help us with a lot of different human problems. So I land in the essay, my favorite image of this sort of like Greek version of human wholeness. It's still paradoxical, but in Plato's Phaedrus, I think you get one of the most beautiful images of what, very briefly, reason and desire would look like if they could be harmonized, and what it would look to love without narcissism. So he gives you this image, Socrates, of the soul as a chariot drawn by two horses. One is rough and aggressive and pulls you towards the beloved, and one is gentle and pulls yourself back. Socrates compares this to himself. He says he doesn't really know if he's like a wild animal or if he's a gentler sort of individual. But so the idea is that if you allow yourself to move towards the beloved and yet have this sort of restraint, you're pulling back on the reins at the same time, you and the beloved love each other with real erotic satisfaction, but you do not pursue satisfaction with the other. You pursue it in this extraordinarily grand vision of the cosmos where both you and the lover are carried up with wings above the sky, and you behold something like a polytheistic heaven. You see all the different things that are true in the world. You see all the gods. You participate in something beyond mere existence together. So there's this profound sense of you've achieved some kind of perfect harmony between you and the beloved, and yet the focus is no longer simply, I must get everything I can from this one person. But in fact, you witnessed all of existence while being carried up by your love for the other person. So I think this is very lovely. It does not solve our problem because in Socrates' story, there is not sex. And if you have sex, you're forever sort of like held back from the full cosmic vision. But then the way he describes it is profoundly erotic. I think he comes up with at least 3 or 4 different sort of like very obvious like descriptions of erotic satisfaction with water, with wings. So you get this tale that takes you to the brink of erotic satisfaction, but also tells you to hold back. And so it doesn't satisfy anybody. It's not a story that says, yes, go out and find lovers. And it's not a story that says, never find lovers. It somehow tells you both. So for me, when I'm thinking about this problem with the thinker, of leaving self behind, of leaving desire behind, I think there is something about the Plato's Phaedrus that does give you a very brief image of what it's like to be a whole person who could be fully erotic and yet not fall into the dangers. So in general, I think the philosophical problem we still have is we need to rethink the human. We need to rethink the human as not simply desire or reason or some kind of conflict between the two, but in a way that acknowledges Eros' power, but then also doesn't sort of just tragically congratulate ourselves on succumbing to the power either. I think that's really difficult. But that's the story I would like to read.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you both, Blake and Mary. I think I will just interject here that the sort of governing idea behind this issue was a sort of an investigation of theorism, and particularly modern theorism. So Mary's concerns, by drawing us back to Plato, in a sense, provide a kind of foil to how theory develops in modernity, in the modern world. Roughly, let's go back to the 1400s, 1500s, 1600s, the critical role of thinkers like Descartes, for example, who locates the seat of certainty in the self. In the classical world and the medieval world, the thinking activity, and correct me, Mary, if I'm wrong, seems more aimed toward contemplation of the good, the beautiful, the true. very little related to what you might call praxis, the sort of practical consequences of thinking or uses. The modern turn, because modern philosophy and thinking is so closely influenced by modern science and technology, is a move toward a kind of practicality, toward results in this world. It becomes the basis of programs, social, political. Think theories provide the basis of what we now call ideologies in many areas. So the purpose of this issue, and to which Blake and Mary responded so well, is to try to really investigate the tangles of theorism, and particularly the extent to which they overpromise an explanation of the world and of ourselves in ways that are delusional often. And the even more provocative thesis I was hoping to advance in the issue is that we in the modern world are particularly theory possessed, whether we know it or not. I think Heidegger would say, most people do not think, they are thought. That's one of his claims in his essay book, What is Thinking? That we are thought. And what thinks us are various theories or ideologies. And that really sort of the low popular end of theorism is what we see so rampantly in our society today, conspiracy theories, as they're called. But how far really are a lot of these conspiracy theories from those theories that are regnant or that reign at the high end of our culture? How entrapped are we by theory? And is this good or bad? And if it is at least mixed, how do we, in a sense, extricate ourselves from the kind of rampant theorism that characterizes, I contend, modernity? Now, many of you might disagree with that premise, but I'll throw that out to Mary and Blake and just ask you if you have any general reactions to that in relation to what you're arguing in your pieces. Blake, do you want to start, and then Mary?
Yes, so thanks for these comments. I mean, I just to think a bit about this idea of possession by theory and fear on the part of a thinker that one is not really thinking but being thought. I mean, this is it's been a few years since I read this Heidegger, what is called thinking, but he has a line something like, whenever we find ourselves like thinking again, we realize we have not been thinking, and there's this kind of anxiety on his part that like I have not been sufficiently thinking, which is also a fear that Barth in some ways has. So he like talks at various points about his like obsessive fear from childhood on of being stupid, that like people will see him as stupid, that he will fail to be sufficiently critical, and this can be, of course, like a source of our theorizing, but then can also be a source of our suspicion of theory. So I think in an initial phase of Barth's career, when he's writing like the mythologies in the 50s, these famous kind of cultural Marxist critiques of advertising, of he has one on professional wrestling, there's another on like Billy Graham coming to France. I mean, they're really like sublime and entertaining and interesting, but they're part of this earlier project in his life when he thinks the thing to do is reveal the working of like capitalist ideology in order or in the service of another kind of theory, so like a sort of Marxist vision of the world. So it's doing sort of precisely the thing you're talking about, Jay, where like if we're showing on the like low popular end the way that conventional thinking is actually ideological, is sort of cliched and secondhand, inauthentic in the service of alienating powers. Well, the theory that critiques that, Barth starts to think in the 60s and 70s, is itself ideological, inauthentic. So like the Marxism in the service of which he'd been critiquing capitalist ideology is also just like a more complicated ideology. And he, by the 70s, wants to be suspicious of the very apparently anti-ideological ideology of revealing, subverting, undoing the hidden power relations in our everyday life. And it's ironically, yeah, exactly in this moment in his intellectual career when he's trying to be done with theory, to dismiss theory both from the right and the left, that he then finds himself really needing to theorize his personal situation, right? Because I think although we would want to be critical of the modern drive to theorize, there also is a way where if we're stuck in some apparently really private agony, it's genuinely really helpful to think this is something that happens to other people. This is a universal or a common human experience, and to start thinking not what is my own situation, but how is it that this happens in general? So yeah, I want to hold on both to the ways that theorizing can be maybe a uniquely modern vice, and something that we weirdly get entangled in even when we're trying to denounce other people's bad ideology, but also something that really helps us survive in the world. If I'm totally trapped in my own quest for a private self-understanding, then I mean, this Eros monster essay of Callard's, where she's obsessively trying to chronicle and think about her relationship with the sky. She presents him with a PowerPoint at one point of the history of their relationship. She's just thinking it within the little box of her own life history, and so doesn't have any leverage over it. Seems like we need theory in that sense. And yeah, I mean, Mary would know better, about that case. So I'll hand it over to her.
Yeah, no, I think that image of being locked in the box of your own theory is very valuable. And it's very true, that there is a tension between our desire to see ourselves in other people and in humanity and at large, and also getting lost in the universal, losing the personal behind. I guess I think the funny aspect of my education is that the Platonists got to me so early that it wasn't till pretty late in my sort of reading of books that I really came across theory as like the model for philosophizing. So to this day, it still kind of confuses me a little. Because I don't know, it's like you have this rigid conceptual structure that someone wrote in a book that people use as sort of a partial window to explain certain kind of phenomena. And the author essentially sort of dines out on the rigidity of the theory, while everyone knows that the argument you have at dinner is the ways in which it's true, the ways in which it's not. I don't know, it seems very strange to me. And I guess for myself, again, in Plato and Aristotle, to contrast to the sort of model of theory as the form of the universal understanding that we're looking for. It seems very important that we want to understand and to know and to see ourselves and other people. But there has to be a different model than just sort of this rigid conceptual structure that we agree to disagree about. So two models for me. For Aristotle, we want our knowing, not our discursive reason, but our sort of unified vision that are the nous, our soul or our thinking self sees, the noetic vision that we have, to be as close to sense perception as possible. It's like he says, when you behold, particularly an organic structure, when you see a cat or a dog, you see it as a whole. And you take in the form in some sense, just in your bare sense perception. So when I'm thinking, when I'm contemplating, my goal is some sense to return to that sense of wholeness, to sort of sit with the wholeness of the thing or the phenomenon, the existence that I'm looking at. That helps me a little, because then my goal isn't a concept that's removed and imprecise from the thing that I'm trying to explain, but remembering while I am thinking the presence of that singular the singularity of the thing that I'm trying to understand, in a way that if I remember my immediate sense perception, that is a model for me in a way. Hegel loves to talk about how if we just stay with sort of a sense perception view of the world, I mean, he's very mean and witty about it. He's like, oh, that's not thinking. You know, you have to move on, you have to transcend, which sure, but also I do love the Aristotelian way in which we sort of come back to that as a good model for thinking. The other one would be Platonic in the sense that when I ascend through the ladder of love, I'm not necessarily in a universal abstract place, but I almost see or touch or be in the room with beauty itself. I could almost reach out my hand and touch it. It's very visceral.
And
It's not a concept that I dine out on, but it's an experience I have. It's a vision, something that I get to be almost like in the vision with.
I was thinking again about another characteristic thinker of the modern world, Spinoza, who is explicitly wary of love. He sees it as a dangerous kind of entrapment, that it will always sort of divert the human from achieving the kind of perspective that he sees as ideal, of a kind of detachment. It's almost a sort of Western Buddhism in some ways. I mean, it's his way of seeing the life of reason. And but it's such a kind of total rejection of it that it's curious. You begin to wonder, what exactly does he mean by love here? And what isn't he showing a kind of passion for this sort of state of achieved reasonableness? A very interesting contrast. We have a number of interesting comments which I would like to read, and if people have questions out there, please feel free to raise your hand and I'll try to get to you. But let me read some of the questions that people have weighed in with. Paul Franz says, if I recall correctly, one of the early instances of theoria in Greek literature is Solon, in Herodotus, telling Croesus that he came to Asia Minor for the sake of theoria, technically sight-seeing. This would seem to comport with the impulse to move beyond particular through suspending, perhaps, the question of the universal. Then Joe Davis notes, I'm reminded of Walker Percy's essay, The Loss of the Creature, where he makes a compelling argument about how theory stands between us and our experience. Theory is a package that disposes of and spoils our relation to the real world. Cheryl Sadowski, part question, part observation. Do any of the mentioned philosophers ever consider or acknowledge the merit of wisdom, a virtue born of time and experience, in being able to manage both eros and reason? It seems the pull toward eros over reason lessens with age. Question for presenters: does not knowledge about our finite existence on earth inform our desire for achieving immortality in all its forms? And then the newish form of writing, Cheryl Sadowski says, autofiction is one interesting way of trying to convey feelings of love and self-awareness in non-traditional form. And I think we've already responded to Stephen Gonzalez, is that this Barth guy sure sounds narcissistic. And maybe narcissism is the general affliction that we're talking about in some ways. But I would also, it seems a lot of these questions bring me to another question, which is the relationship between religion and theorism, if you want to call it that. Is theorism attempting to replace, supplement, augment what religion once provided, in terms of what somebody is talking about here, about sort of the search for immortality, if that's what we consider one of religion's major claims or provisions. So I throw those observations to you and questions and reflections from the audience. Mary, why don't you go first this time?
Sure, let me see. I think that just dealing with the most recent thought about theory's relation to religion and the desire for immortality. I mean, if theory is supposed to be replacing religion, it's doing such a terrible job. Theory always seems to me, again, like it's rooted in people who are sort of professional theorists, which just is a fundamentally secular sort of thing. Like I do a thing, I write a book, I get paid, you know, I go on the circuit. It's very commercial in a way. So that it's not about like finding a sort of a spiritual presence apart from like the apparatus of communicating in this very specific commercial way to other people. It's just, it's very drab. It seems very drab.
I would give two votes, at least. I would attribute it to some theorists, a kind of deep and sincere search for meaning, however misplaced, that the theory as interpretation of the world, which many theories involve, do at least seek meaning. It seems to me that that's one thing that the theorist, I mean, I think Spinoza, I think Hegel, all of them thought they were engaged in a sort of post-religious quest for meaning, that meaning could be arrived at, ultimate meaning. Maybe it would be through history and the realization of the rational and the real in history. But I think there was, I don't think they were just doing it as part of their job. And I would push back.
Oh, sure.
On that.
And I'm just
Okay.
holding out philosophy as like the deeper way of seeking to explain and understand and be present to the world. And certainly I think Hegel's trying to do that, though he certainly got paid.
Yeah.
You know, I'm always like, it sounds trivial, but it is not trivial that the Socratic model rejects money. That you might, like Diogenes the Cynic, live in a barrel. That like somehow we've lost the thread once we make theory or like the search for truth into something that you can do professionally. Obviously, we can't necessarily live like that. We don't choose to live like that, but when we become part of that structure, we are jumping into capitalist concerns, jumping into material concerns.
Blake?
Well, I should say, you know, I appreciated my honorarium for the essay. And, you know, if it had been 100 times as much, I would have, you know, appreciated it still more. So I for one, am critical in theory of capitalist relations, but personally, you know, in favor of them. For the religion thing, I mean, part of what appeals to me about Barth is he grows up Protestant in southwestern France and has in some ways like a very kind of Protestant view, which in France is a tiny minority. It's like, you know, 1%. And so he's, I think, very skeptical of what he sees as like a Catholic understanding of religiosity for most of his career. But in the end of Fragments of a Lover's Discourse, he starts consciously drawing on the language of early modern Catholic mystics like St. John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila, because he says for him, the mystics, unlike theologians, but also philosophers, are trying to think about love, in their case of God, not as ultimately leading to some like universal framework of understanding that would kind of sublimate them out of the intense emotional experience, but as really always focused on like the phenomenology of what they're experiencing and the beauty, not of beauty in general, or like the form of beauty, but the beauty of the beloved. And that there's like always an erotic dimension to that. So if you look at like the poems of St. John of the Cross, which are really beautiful, or going back to the Song of Songs, that there is consistently this singularizing and sexualized dimension of that spiritual experience. And Barth says, like in our own era, the main theoretical discourses, like for him Marxism, ignore love completely, or like psychoanalysis, treat love as a kind of case that can be studied and cured, but they're not interested in helping us rightly understand or apprehend the singularity of the beloved. I mean, part of what his book turns on is in a version of the problem that the mystics have, right, where like God is both this like singular, utterly different, in some ways unknowable other, but also other that we're compelled to talk about and ascribe qualities to, and write tomes of theology about. Barth wants to say, love discloses for me the total irreplaceability and uniqueness of the other person. And there's something that I think is really true and important about that. That like being able to fall in love with someone is this wonderful gift where we can see how another person is, totally unique and lovable in their uniqueness. But also, as he sort of notes while he's working through the book, the person I fall in love with is like unique to me, but my friends can always say like, oh yeah, of course, that's just your type. Like, there you go again, falling in love. Oh, one of your students. Oh, how interesting that you fell in love with that, really. There's something both totally unique and ineffable and endlessly fascinating, and something also entirely scripted, which is also true of these mystic experiences, right? I mean, the like early modern Spanish mystics sort of tell you how to produce mystical experiences. They give you like a guide to having a dark night of the soul, to moving through to some vision of beatitude, and wanting to hold on to both what is this is also maybe for like Mary, like another version of the Hegel problem. I am not a Hegel person. Barth is not a Hegel person, but maybe one has to go back to Hegel for this. Like the wanting to hold on to the sensuous particular in all its uniqueness, but also that if you're stuck in that, you are in fact kind of stupid, right? I mean, at some point, like Barth says, like, if I'm in that mode, all I can say about the other person is they're so lovable. Gosh, he's great, but I can't explain to my friends, who don't get it, why he's actually great.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think, because I both made the argument before for sort of moving past purely the sensuous because of that sort of like inability to talk. But then it is funny how like sometimes it is just sort of like a cow munching kind of like, caught in that sort of like looking at the sensuous particular. But then sometimes it does actually like, it is like the outer structure around like a very profound experience that can't be articulated. And so when we're like, well, this person can't articulate it, we're sort of like missing something. But then like, how do you tell the difference is another problem. I see.
Tom Ricketts is far more succinct in saying, doesn't that loop back to Spinoza, love of God as the ultimate theory? And Ed Rubin has a question that he would like to ask Edward Rubin. Edward, can you bring Edward Rubin in? And then Joey Keegan would like to ask a question from the audience. And Isaac Reed. So let's, Edward, I saw your message first, and then Joey, and then Isaac. Edward, can we let Edward in, Leanne? Or is this working?
They need to unmute themselves to ask a question.
Edward, can you ask, are you still there? Well, okay, we will go to Joey Keegan. Please ask away.
Yeah, and Ed, if you come back, feel free to interrupt me. I'm so good to be here with you guys. These are two really good friends of mine who are in discussion with each other, I think, for the first time, which is really fun. And so I want to ask about friendship. Both of you wrote about this kind of problem of erotics, right? Of the desire for the singular erotic object. As Blake noted, right, the thing about the object of erotic love is that it is the strange problem where from the inside, when you're doing the loving, it's this totally singular, completely unique thing that you desire for your own. From the outside, it has a totally different perspective. Reconciling those perspectives is very different. I'm sort of curious about whether this problem of theory, right, this kind of solipsistic issue of wanting to sort of devise a grand total scheme of the entirety of the world through your own sort of solipsistic mode of thought, if that isn't actually kind of if that doesn't map onto sort of like what the lover does when trying to think about the beloved, right? I think about these various times that I personally have been in love, right? You tell yourself this big grand story about what's going on at every step along the way, however inaccurate it might be. And it's almost totally barely anybody can affect it from the outside, right? It's like it becomes this very solipsistic monologic kind of endeavor. And I contrast that to friendship. What's so beautiful about friendship is that, right, there is a singularity of the friend. I appreciate both of you for who you are as people, and I've shared many great conversations and thinking with both of you and your individuality, but I don't and I think this holds for friendship generally. There isn't this desire for the soul, like I don't want to be the only friend of my friends, right? I do want to be the only lover of my lovers, but that's not the case for friends. And friendship it's not solipsistic. It's very dialogic, right? It has to be dialogic or else friendship won't work. And so I guess I'm wondering if the reconciliation of this perspective, right, of the sort of the interior perspective of the lover seeking the beloved, and then this exterior perspective of the kind of ridiculousness of what it looks like to be a lover, that seems totally, I mean, we have accounts of that going all the way back to Plato. I mean, that seems a sort of permanent condition of erotics, right? But I'm sort of wondering to what extent something, if maybe this is a terrible neologism, philetics, right? Like this different approach to loving a person, loving a thing, seeking a kind of knowledge in the form of philia rather than in the form of eros. Is that even possible? What would that even look like? Would that overcome the problem? I sort of toss it at both of you.
Yeah, that's a really important question. And it does seem like friendship can solve so many of those problems, but I want to hold out for there still needing to be a tension between friendship and eros, in the sense that friendship can keep you from being solipsistic. It keeps you from being wrong a lot, and your friend's there to say, that's silly, in a way that's helpful, and then sort of like burst the bubble in a way that the grand cosmic scheme that you create about the lover and yourself can't. On the other hand, there is a way in which the comfort with a friend being so different from the way that eros sort of like dramatically pulls you and bursts you out of yourself, when it really does, and not just in a sort of a narcissistic way. I feel like that element is in tension with the comfort of friendship, in that, like, if the goal is to leave behind the self for a moment and really, really, really leave yourself and really look at something other than yourself, even though eros is very dangerous and often very bad at this, in some way it has an escape velocity. Maybe I'm arguing today that maybe friendship doesn't, or doesn't always. And that's why I sort of want to hold on to them both and not just say that friendship can solve it, if that makes sense.
Right, I think, yeah, Mary is totally right. And I mean, it would be interesting to track, like there are a bunch of different discourses where people try to replace eros totally with friendship. So I would know less, but there are like sort of orthodox traditions where people talk about themselves as friends of God, where it's like a mystical tradition that is not organized around the erotic, the way that I think of like Western Christian and like South Asian traditions being. To me, that seems really weird to be like God's friend. But I mean, this is also maybe something in evangelical culture, like, the movie Dogma was like making fun of this with like Buddy Christ. It's like, just your friend, God. And there are also efforts, in kind of polyamorous communities to imagine like sexual relations as like transcending jealousy and being a kind of friendship where like I don't mind that my lover has other lovers and I'm happy for them, and like we're just sort of great friends who have sex with each other, which maybe is how some people do in fact organize their sexual lives, but to me seems really it's like a sort of module of my brain would have to be taken out. Or Foucault, has this essay on male homosexuality, friendship as a way of life, where he's wanting to think about like male-male sexual relations as like being organized around friendship and new ways of living together, which again, like, I have plenty of friends, and like that's not the need of my life. And right, as Mary says, there's a way where overly investing in the negative power of Eros or its power to disrupt us can in fact be just a disguised form of narcissism, right? Where like, if I say I'm Madame Bovary and I'm giving a kind of dark enchantment to my very normal, boring life by having some supposedly intense erotic encounter, which maybe Bart was in some way doing, this sort of like Sturm und Drang version of how Stella got her groove back, right? That is in fact just shoring up the narcissism that it purports to trouble. But there is there's a long tradition, like in psychoanalysis, with people like Laplanche, and like in American queer theory with people like Leo Bersani, of thinking about Eros as related to like what he calls self-shattering or self-scattering, like a dispersal and suspension of the self. And I think it's even the case that this isn't just like a negative feature, but this is part of why people seek out the erotic. This is part of the pleasure of sex, right? In a way that like friendship can be very like an intensification of my sameness. It can be a kind of mirror, or the difference that I find in my friend isn't fundamentally disturbing. Like even to think, the annoying traits that my partner has light me up, right? Like just drive me crazy. Like, oh, like you're slurping again, like, oh my God. In a way that like Joey, like, I mean, I love you as a friend, but like you're annoying, like they don't bother me. You're not my problem, like it doesn't, neither the pleasure of friendship can like shatter or suspend myself the way that sex can, nor is my being at stake in our friendship the way that it is with like a romantic partner. And it seems like that intensity also has something important to do with the intensity of thinking. Are
you thinking now?
No, I run out of thinking. I have the
Okay.
thinking. Yeah, thinking is now over.
Isaac Reed, would you have a question? And then we'll try Ed again.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
So thanks so much, and I've learned really a great deal from this discussion, these essays, and the point is clear that something about the human experience of Eros is related to the singularizing move, and there are many schemas of modern thought that resist any singularizing, and when they do that, they make things like judgment much harder to grasp. Nonetheless, I want to ask the two panelists to ask you to think about what the significance is, or even motivation or desire is, behind the desire to exit theory. This is addressed in Blake's essay about sort of about structuralism and what Barthes was trying to get away from, but I would want to also ask about what is significant to us right now about wanting to re-find our way to the concrete and the perceptive, and perception and the singular other, and all of these things that we have just discussed, including these very interesting comments we just heard on sort of self-destruction. And if I could just sort of frame that with a little bit of, I hope, healthy skepticism. I guess I did not know, but I am not surprised that the attempt of Roland Barthes to go to psychoanalysis with Jacques Lacan failed. I can imagine that Lacan would have found Barthes' attempt to exit theory and find his singular lover in the concreteness of declaration, et cetera, to be a kind of unsustainable fantasy of exiting the symbolic entirely. And I would ask us to think about whether the desire to exit theory might have some aspects of a kind of fantasy of exiting the symbolic or the mediated or the conceptual. And I don't know what the historical reasons for that would have been in 1974 or what they exactly are in our current situation in 2023, but I would very much like to invite the two panelists to sort of reflect a little bit on what is the significance exactly of this desire to exit theory.
Mary, go ahead. Or Blake, whoever.
Yeah, sure. Blake can speak to the Barthes and the symbolic and the Lacan. I think for myself, trying to put myself into the frame and be honest about why I would want to exit theory. I mean, in part, I mean, it just seems like it's not going to lead me to truth. So I want something that's more true. I hold out the sensual and concrete, as it seems Barthes wanted briefly, as one alternative, but my ultimate goal still is to find reality, to find truth, which I'm sort of suspicious of human conceptualizing as the best mode of human philosophizing, of finding wisdom and so forth. And I think probably for myself, what it might overlook is that exiting theory, in some sense, we can't. I mean, we are tied into concepts and historical patterns of thinking. I mean, in a way, it sort of represents a very human and universal frustration with human limitation, that if I sort of pretend that I can escape human limitation by leaving theory, then I'm ignoring the fact that I'll never achieve like perfect knowledge, perfect wisdom anyway. So it's not like I can sort of like suddenly come up with magical philosophy that will, free me from my mortality, free me from the limits of my thinking. It just seems a little bit better. That's why I'm invested in it. And ultimately less boring.
Thank you, Mary.
I mean, I think on the one hand, like I'm not I'm not an anti-theory person, and I think indeed, in some ways, like a legacy of this 1970s French moment as it comes to America is that it degrades our capacity for theoretical thinking, or like it like we receive like French theory with a capital F, capital T, but like it's a sort of thing that isn't theory in the sense that it's not a substitute for Marxism, which is something I think like we still need in our politics, like a way of thinking about the economy and society and political action that like relate in a meaningful whole and let us tell a story about like how does this strike or this law relate to some grand scheme. I mean, these kind of big narratives are problematic or falsifying. The Marxist one, didn't work out so well. But I think what we see in the last couple of generations of politics, like in America and Europe, is it's really hard to fight things like income inequality or declining living standards, or sort of a general like malaise, if you can't tell some story about like, well, how should the economy work? Like what's happening? How should it happen? That's in fact theory. But I was just talking yesterday to a friend who, after like several months of sort of immobilizing depression, is like applying to jobs and is sort of getting herself out of her rut. And I was telling him, I'm so glad that you're like recovering this sense of agency, because the last time we had a serious conversation, I was like, oh, you should, maybe you could look for other jobs. She said, well, in late capitalism, no one likes their job. right? So that's a kind of theory. Like, you know, if a Marxist theory would tell us like we must go on strike so we can overthrow the bourgeoisie, that's a theory that's like enabling action. We could also have like a version of the same theory that's like, well, I don't need to think about my own circumstances. I don't need to take control of my life because I know that nothing is possible under the sort of conditions we live in. How you can be aware to yourself whether you're having a theory that is capacitating or discapacitating. I mean, that seems to like require us to have a level of maybe we could say irony or reflexivity about our use of theory, which is maybe not possible. In the Fragments of the Lover's Discourse, Barthes tries to articulate what he calls the non-vouloir saisir, like the not wanting to grasp, which is both the attitude that he wants to have toward his beloved, who he knows is never going to return his feelings. Like, I want to be able to feel what I'm feeling without like annoying them and crushing them with my like overly intense feelings, without like making them crazy, without going crazy myself. And also theoretically, I want to understand what's happening. I want to be able to have a kind of story about what I'm doing. I want to be able to understand what love is, but I don't want to like choke the concept to death, right? I don't want to like, as Callard does in this essay that Mary refers to, Eros Monster, like I don't want to spend all my time obsessively making PowerPoints about what's going on in our relationship. And the question of how to develop that attitude toward like the singular beloved or like to the object of perception and to my own theorizing, right? Where I can kind of take a step back and say like, oh yes, I am feeling in love in this particular way, or I am like driven to theory, but you know, I don't have to like do it so obsessively. Yeah, the question of how to cultivate that attitude seems like really important, but I don't know how we acquire that.
Well, and it sounds like you're also sort of describing in a way our need for myth. Like I need a myth, a grand story of the world, a narrative that spurs me to action, that makes me braver and stronger and keener on the search. And it seems, well, I guess my prejudice would be that a myth is sort of more sort of like originating in terms of like helping me move and helping me make good judgments about these things.
I mean, right, it's so interesting you used that word. Like I hadn't thought in the sense, but right, I mean, Barthes' first popular book, like the Mythologies, is this critique of what he thinks of as capitalist myths, you know, like the myths in advertising and how we should see through them. I mean, the concept he comes up with in the 70s, almost to replace it, is the idea of type. Like if I think of myself when I'm in love, not just as like me personally, but as the lover, this sort of, we could say, mythical figure, that gives me a kind of leverage, right? Like, oh, I find myself doing the things that people in love do. Like I'm writing all of these crazy letters to this other person. You know, I'm waiting for their phone call, but it's not just me who does this. It is like the lover. And I think, yeah, now people get a lot of thinking about like their astrological sign, like I'm being such an Aquarius right now. And it's tempting to just make fun of that from some like intellectual perspective. But I think having a sense that I am participating in an archetype, which I can do sort of semi-ironically, right? Like I'm not saying like I am purely an Aquarius, that Aquariuses are totally real, but it gives an additional, it's a sort of mediating term between the universalism of theory, or like the really strong epistemic pretensions of theory to explain everything, and the singular self. There's this mediating stuff.
Right. No, that seems absolutely true, like of how people use the sort of the strange like Aquarius talk. To me, it seems that archetype is to myth as theory is to philosophy. That archetype is still a sort of like a debased form of myth. Whereas myth is, I don't have to sort of say like, this is true of me, but it's more sort of a cosmic scheme that I can be like, I participate in this. This doesn't reflect me necessarily or explain me, but it's part of the story of how I fit into all things. Anyway,
I did want to bring Ed in if he's able to ask his question now, to unmute himself.
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. It's not a question. First of all, I want to thank Hedgehog for continuing my education. And I see you just posted that I didn't know you were a review, so I'm going to subscribe. I also want to thank Blake and Mary and Jay for their sharing their thoughts and work. I did want to say, in relation to Heidegger, what is thinking? We are not thinking, we are thought, opens up, reminds me of Hannah Arendt, who studied with him, was his lover, and she wrote a lot about thinking. And one of the things that struck me that she said is, to think, you have to stop, which makes a lot of sense. I do want to recommend a book, one of the best things I've read on eroticism and love is Octavio Paz burning, what is it? Octavio Paz burning. Oh, I just wrote this. Double Flame. He writes about, it's just a wonderful book of essays, and it's just quite wonderful. And I might add that everything I'm reading today and hearing, including this piece of theater, because this is theater I'm watching, and I write about art culture and art culture and entertainment, and theater is one of the things I write about, is now everything is happening, and the saying is everything, everywhere, all at once. That's what seems to be happening. Even in everything you kids said, if I was to review this as a piece of theater, it would take me a week to unravel and put together and make it a coherent story. I curated a show once, and at the end, I said, all we have left is a story. And I like the way Mary said myth. So I took a lot of notes, and I just want to thank, this is such a wonderful program, and I hope you just keep letting me know when these come up so I could sit in on it. That's all I have to say, you know. Oh, I did want to say one thing. I think that you saying that Barth had a lot of affairs with his students and they were not emotional. And I think that that's a supposition. I do think one of the things about love, and let's talk about unrequited love, is a curse and a blessing, as is life, a curse and a blessing, because unrequited love involves sweet pain, a sweet pain. It's kind of a wonderful kind of thing of pain, of knowing that one, you can love, and two, it's always there somehow in some shape or form. That's all, but I want to thank everybody for today.
Thank you, Ed. And I promise that was not a paid commercial announcement. Thank you for your appreciation of the speakers today. And I, of course, second that appreciation. Tom Ricketts has another comment. May I wander back a bit, back to the connection between love and theory. Love as theory can compel and impel. Can one use love to motivate political adhesion or action? Certainly. We invoke love of country to motivate soldiers, patent channel. The lurching toward eroticism in this kind of love may be the kind that guides the paths taken by Caesar, Hitler, or Putin, but more so the enablers of those lovers of power. An eroticism of power, as it might be. At the core of that is a form of self-love, or love of one's belief, satisfied by submission. Love that can erase reason, either reason on the part of the leader or the follower. Patriotism may then become love of the fatherland that erases or subsumes other forms of love. I'm sorry to answer that question, Tom. We don't have our third panelist because he was speaking directly about the sort of theorism that was favored by many in the last century that did try to merge this kind of passionate patriot or nationalism or ethnic nationalism in particular. He was going to be speaking about this German thinker Othman Spahn, or Austrian actually, in Vienna, who was a sort of charismatic professor at the University of Vienna, and also was the leader of a circle of thinkers in Vienna that included people like Friedrich Hayek, though these followers mainly rejected Othman Spahn because he was a bit of a, among other things, an anti-Semite, and had a very mystical notion of what knowledge was all about, and what the German state and people were all about. So we would have gotten into that a little more directly, but of course, I think Eros and ideology, and particularly forms of political nationalist and fascist ideologies, very much saw a dangerous merger of Eros, a kind of Eros. Blake, I know you're nodding your head there.
Right. So, I mean, there's the potentially dangerous model where our erotic energy is like available to the collective for some political project. And in, I guess in some ways this is like celebrated by some of the people in the symposium, right? That we could have like an army of lovers who are particularly useful to the state because they're all, erotically connected to each other. This is a fear that like Freud has in his collective psychology, that we could be erotically connected to a charismatic leader or to the idea of the people instead of to like these private ties. And I think part of what I'm trying to do in this eventual book project is to read Barth in the 70s as moving to a refoundation of political liberalism, what he calls a second liberalism, which is really based on the intensity of private life. And one of the key moments that I see in that is he has this trip to Maoist China with some other members of this radical left group, Tel Kel, including like Julia Kristeva. And Barth just publishes a very short description of China in which he says it was like a boring and stupid trip. And this sort of announces his permanent break with the left. And then he has a very long, like 300-page set of notes that he doesn't publish about what happens. And the notes are like incredibly obsessed with sex. So I won't say in English, but he has like a line where he's like, I've spent 3 weeks here, j'ai pas vu une bite chinoise. So, he didn't have any sexual fun while he was there. And he's consistently impressed with like, everyone's wearing the same clothes, everyone's speaking in the same cliches. So there's no possibility of having like the erotic land anywhere. Like everything is, about like the people, the collective, all of the emotional energy is toward that. But he has one kind of moving passage where the group is being given like a tour of a factory, and he ends up holding the guide's hand for several minutes, and I guess giving it a kind of intense squeeze. And like, this is like his one moment of a sort of singular physical erotic contact. And yeah, I think his sense is that the ability to have and preserve those connections, I mean, this is why we would want something like a private sphere. This is like the sake for which we would want to keep some things unpolitical, is to preserve those kinds of fragile but intense connections. And right, like the danger is, on the one hand, they're a kind of energy that can be put in the service of big collective projects. And on the other, like, if we don't have some ability to have those, like if we can't make those kind of connections, at least from his perspective, like, there's no good life, right? So how to like have the erotic and how to also keep it bound where it ought to be, so that, we're not eroticizing the political.
Well, I know we've kept everybody over our hour, our noon discussion of an hour, but thank you. I would like to thank everybody who has certainly our guests, speakers today, Mary and Blake. It was really an enriching time. I only regret that we weren't gathering in person. There's always something far more erotic in the best sense of a physical gathering where we have something to eat and drink afterwards or maybe before, but which is what we used to do with these noon discussions at the Institute. Sometimes they go hybrid and we have a little of each. Well, that always feels like, as though we're cheating the Zoomers. But in this most alienating form, I think we've managed to overcome a little of its alienating effects and had a bit of a symposium in the sense that the mind does go out in a symposium and connects. So I would like to thank all of our participants and guests and various contributors to the conversation. And I hope, as I say, I hope we can all gather here in the real flesh over around a real table someday in the not too distant future. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.